Hello, I'm Ashley Wilson, Assistant Director of Empowered 21, and I want to welcome you to the Empowered 21 Leadership Podcast. I'm here today with Dr. Todd Johnson from the Gordon Conwell Center for the Study of Global Christianity. Dr. Johnson, welcome. We're glad to have you today.
Glad to be here.
We're excited about what you've been doing, which is kind of a multi-year study on the Spirit-empowered movement and what that looks like, its growth rate around the world. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we get into the study, tell me a little bit about yourself, Dr. Johnson.
Well, I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my parents were farmers who moved into the city and worked in factories. So I'm actually the first person in my extended family to go to college.
Oh, wow.
First to a BA, then an MA, then a PhD. But I worked on multiplication tables with my father when I was, in elementary school, and I even tutored other students in math. So I loved math, but then I got into missions, and I thought there's no place for math in missions. But I ran into my father-in-law, Ralph Winter, who really encouraged me to mix the two, to take my math interest and apply it to missions. So I began counting all sorts of things that are related to missions and to global Christianity, and I've spent my whole life counting, which I love to do.
Wow, that's an amazing story, how you were able to marry the two passions into something that's become, I think, very beneficial for the kingdom of God. So tell us a little bit about this study that you've undertaken, looking at the Spirit-empowered movement around the world. Maybe define in your terms what Spirit-empowered means and what we mean when we talk about the Spirit-empowered movement.
Right. Well, this study really goes back many decades. In fact, we credit much of what we're doing to David Barrett, who was an Anglican missionary, went to Kenya in the 1950s. And then he started researching in the 60s, and then he's the one who actually began to count Pentecostals and Charismatics. And so I joined him in 1989, and we set out counting. And we looked at three different types of Pentecostals around the world. First of all, classical Pentecostals, and then Charismatics in the mainline churches, which was my experience, and then independent Charismatics that came a bit later and spread, all over the world. And so we used to call all of that renewalists because it was hard to know what to call the whole thing since you had so many different pieces. But in the last few years in studying this, we felt that this newer term, Spirit-empowered Christianity, a Spirit-empowered movement within Christianity, is really a great term to use. So it includes all kinds of Pentecostals, Charismatics, and independent Charismatics. It's a very expansive term, but it's roughly equivalent to what people used to mean by global renewalists, or people say global Pentecostals, and oftentimes they're talking about a much wider phenomenon, which would include Catholic Charismatics, for example. Sure. So we're really in this. We're really in the same team that we were in earlier as far as how we're considering this.
We just have a new way of talking about it.
That's right. Yeah. So it's not a different group of people, but it's maybe a term that might be useful now.
Okay, wonderful. So in this study that you've undertaken, tell me, what are some of the highlights of what you've found over the last few years as you've really been digging deep into what the Spirit-empowered movement is around the world and its rate of growth and things like that?
Right. Well, I think the big news is growth, actually, and now that we finished this latest study, we can say pretty definitively that Spirit-empowered Christians were only 0.1% of the world's population in 1900. Of course, that was back when things were getting started.
Right.
And then in 2020, we think it's 8.3%.
Wow.
Which means 1 out of every 12 people in the world is a Spirit-empowered Christian.
Wow.
So that's phenomenal, that kind of growth. It's 4 times the growth rate of global Christianity over that same period.
Okay.
And we think, and it's now 644 million is what we're saying for 2020. We're pretty sure that we're going to hit 1 billion before 2050. And when that happens, we're talking about 1 in 10, or even
Wow.
less than 1 in 10 will be Spirit-empowered Christians on the whole planet. It's about 26% of all Christians right now,
Yeah.
and it's on its way to 30, maybe 33. So, we were recently 1 out of every 4 Christians, Spirit-empowered Christian, and in the future, possibly 1 out of every 3.
Wow.
So it's really a story of growth. That's one of the most significant things. And from now until 2050, we think it's going to grow twice as fast as Christianity is growing as a whole.
That's exciting. Where are you seeing kind of the most explosive growth in the Spirit-empowered community? What's been kind of the real growth story?
Yeah. Well, the anchors of the movement are well known, like Brazil. Brazil has all different kinds of Spirit-empowered Christians. The Pentecostal church is very strong in Brazil. The Catholic charismatics have been growing in Brazil, and independent groups have been growing there. So that's really one of the most amazing places when it comes to the phenomenon. But there's a lot of others. There's Nigeria in Africa, or even the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been under a lot of pressure with civil war and that sort of a thing, or the Philippines, and the newcomers now being China, India, 2 largest countries in the world, are under some change now as it comes to the Spirit-empowered Christianity. So those are all huge countries with huge numbers. Mexico is another place. But the fastest growing places are actually the smallest, because it's easier to grow faster when you're small. And I was recently in Thailand, and on my way back, I stopped in Doha in Qatar. And I was amused to find on my list as we were finishing this study that Qatar has the fastest growing Spirit-empowered Christians movement in the world. And it's because of immigration or migration.
Sure.
And the migrant workers who are working there are Spirit-empowered Christians in large numbers. So it's just a big movement of people into a country, but it's rather
But as they come
interesting.
in, they're bringing their Spirit-empowered Christianity with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very exciting.
Yeah, and even Saudi Arabia has about 1 million Filipinos, and Filipinos, both as Protestants, Pentecostals, charismatic Catholics, that's a huge number of people in Saudi Arabia who are Spirit-empowered.
Yeah, that's exciting. You think about what Jesus talks about with the yeast, kind of how it works its way through the whole loaf, and I think our prayer would be that as those small groups of people move into those countries, that there would be some relationship building that would happen there, and the gospel would be spread. I know you shared something in another video of yours that I watched that I was particularly challenged with, and that was the statistic that 87% of the world's Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus do not personally know a Christian. Can you talk about that a little bit, and what that it says to us as kind of a challenge for Spirit-empowered Christianity?
Yeah, that's right. That in fact is probably our greatest challenge going forward, because Spirit-empowered Christians, maybe in particular, are aware of the fact that the gospel is for the whole world, for all the peoples of the world. And we've been studying the peoples of the world for quite some time, maybe 30, 40 years now. And what we did is we looked at ways that we could try to measure personal contact between Christians and non-Christians. And as we did that, that's where we discovered this gap of 87%. So there are a lot of people around the world who just have no personal contact with Christians. But one of the other things that we've discovered about Spirit-empowered Christianity is that it has shifted to the south, just like global Christianity. This is our biggest finding in global Christianity, is that in 1900, 82% of all Christians were Europeans or North Americans. Today, it's only 33%, which means 67% of all Christians in the world are Asians, Africans, Latin Americans, or from Oceania.
Wow.
Now, with Spirit-empowered Christians, this is a brand new finding for us. We just recently discovered that Spirit-empowered Christians in 2020, 86% of all Spirit-empowered Christians are in the global South, which
86%.
86%, which is actually quite good news for this 87%, completely different statistic, of lack of personal contact, because the people who've never heard of Christ and have no contact with Christians are in the global South. They're in Asia in particular. So the fact that Spirit-empowered Christianity has shifted and grown so much in the global South means that Christians, Spirit-empowered Christians in the global South, are in proximity with people of other religions. So the big question is, when and where is the friendship, and the hospitality and the personal contact? That's I think the biggest challenge that Christians face, but also I think Spirit-empowered Christians are uniquely placed in the global South to address this tremendous shortfall. So I think that's an exciting.
That's extremely exciting that Spirit-empowered Christians are on the forefront, on the front of the line, if you will, of where the gospel need is the greatest. Yeah. What other trends, as you've done this study, what other trends have you seen in Spirit-empowered Christianity that have kind of jumped out at you?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of unexpected things, which I think bode well for the future as we talk about what's going to happen around the world among Spirit-empowered Christians. One is that almost all of our founders, the founders of the Pentecostal charismatic movement around the world, were heavily engaged in ministry to the poor.
Okay.
And one of the problems that Christians have faced in the 20th century is an artificial divide between evangelism and social action, and social justice, okay? And yet our founders did not have that problem. They did not see a divide between these two. They preached the gospel and they ministered to the poor. And a major study was done of Spirit-empowered Christians around the world a few years ago, and it came up with a surprising finding that most of the churches of Spirit-empowered Christians are heavily engaged in ministry to the poor and doing health and education and all sorts of justice work. And that, I think, is really encouraging because the artificial divide between these has been hurtful to Christianity. And a lot of the people who need the gospel are also in need of care of various kinds, And so I think this is a very forward-looking part of the Spirit-empowered movement. I think we're uniquely poised to meet people's needs and to preach the gospel and not see the difference. I was reading something a couple days ago where Amy Semple McPherson, who started the Foursquare Church, she said, we are not just to be good. No, she said, true Christianity is not just to be good, but to do good.
Yeah.
And I love that quote because I think that's saying, again, these are integrated. If you're empowered by the Spirit, you are preaching the gospel, but you're also engaged in social action. And that, to me, is a very encouraging finding.
I think it's interesting that global poverty and people who would be most in need of social justice type work tend to be, I think, based on what you've said, in this global South area where Spirit-empowered Christians are at their strongest. So there's a great opportunity there that I'm excited about. So what else? I noticed you talk a little bit about women in Spirit-empowered Christianity. What have you discovered as you've studied that?
Yeah, well, that's another encouraging sign, although I think we have some work to do. If you look back at the history of the spread of the Spirit-empowered movement, you see women everywhere.
Yeah, I will say this. The first preacher in our family was my great-grandmother, who in the 1920s and 30s traveled the southeast United States as a single woman, holding Pentecostal revivals until my great-grandfather was saved in her ministry, and they got married, and the rest is history. So
that's right. Yeah, and that's very typical. We just did an encyclopedia, the World Christian Encyclopedia, and we had people all over the world helping us with photographs. So we said, send us photographs of Christians doing things. And we got photos from all over the world, and they were mainly women that were actually doing the things.
Yeah.
But the difficulty is women have done a lot of the work, and men seem to be doing a lot of the explaining. So we're hoping, that again we'll see women not only doing the work, but involved in leadership, which is also something that's been true in the Spirit-empowered movement, that women have had leadership roles. And there's differing opinions within our movement about what should be done. But nevertheless, that's an area that would be very, very important in the future, is to recognize the role of women.
A lot of the people who watch this podcast are younger leaders. And so what would you say to a young, Spirit-empowered leader, somebody in their 20s who's just kind of starting out in ministry? What do you see as the future for them in the Spirit-empowered movement on a broad level, and maybe some advice that you might give to them?
Yeah, well, these trends of more social action and social justice, this is an area where people can get involved. And recognizing the role of women is another area that will, I think, attract younger people to be more engaged. But a third area is the fact that the world is becoming increasingly diverse. People are moving all around. And I've noticed that younger people seem to be more comfortable with diversity.
Yeah.
And some of us older people are nervous about that, but I think younger people are well suited to be friends with people in other religions, of other ethnicities. I think another thing that we started out strong as was in racial reconciliation. Azusa Street and so on. It was part of who we were, and then we split, into different groups. And I think it's time to come back together. And I think that's something that younger people can work on, is bringing all this diversity within the Spirit-empowered movement together, but also being adept at operating with people who are from many different backgrounds, ethnic and religious backgrounds. I think there's something new that's going to happen in that area that's been eluding us, and it might be why the statistic of 87% who don't know, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists don't know a Christian personally. That's something younger people can work on, and I think they're uniquely placed to really do something about it.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Johnson, thank you for being with us today. Again, thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe. Either follow us and subscribe on YouTube, or subscribe on iTunes, and look for new releases of the Empowered 21 Leadership Podcast. Again, I'm Ashley Wilson. Thank you for joining us.